This week, Paul and I continue our conversation on building your AppSec program. In the news, Twitter says all 336 million users should change their passwords. Somebody tried to hide a backdoor in a popular JavaScript NPM package, and the evolving developer mindset. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Today's determined attackers easily bypass even the most advanced network defenses. Trying to ramp up staff to detect their backdoors can cost thousands of dollars and take months, even years. With Active Countermeasures AI Hunter, we enable junior analysts to detect even the most advanced backdoors in a matter of hours. Sign up for a demo and purchase our product today by visiting activecountermeasures.com/ASW. Active Countermeasures. Make every analyst a hunter. IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. Watch over 3,300 hours of content in their on-demand library, on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for teams by visiting itpro.tv/Security Weekly and start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off standard or premium IT Pro TV memberships using the code SECWeekly30.
Welcome everyone to episode 15, our 16th episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I'm excited to be joined by my otherwise clean-shaven co-host, Paul Asadorian.
Hey, thanks, Keith. How are you? What's going on? Excited to be here on Application Security Weekly.
Yeah, it's another great week. It's starting to get beautiful out here in New England, finally. And yeah, we got a lot of cool stuff going on this week, including, of course, Source Boston coming up this week. Paul, I hear your slide deck is almost done at this point.
I actually learned a lot from developing the slide deck. It allowed me the opportunity to reflect on everything I've learned in the past, I would say, year plus, taking our application from where it was at the time all the way to where it is today, and having a plan, for the future, which, well, it's double duty, right? It helps us here at Security Weekly. It helps me understand this whole application security thing, and as it applies to DevOps and Docker containers and orchestrators and all that stuff. So that's nice when anytime projects overlap, but it also, helps our business of podcasting. So I've just, a couple of, I don't know if we have time at the top of the show to talk about it, Keith. I'm anxious to get your thoughts. As I built the presentation, I realized that some of the main takeaways that I certainly learned in the whole process that I probably should have learned earlier on, and I learned by mistake, right? Which I guess is the best way to learn. But the immutability of containers should not be underestimated. And I think that coming from kind of an old school systems, Unix, Linux systems administrator, Windows systems administrator before that, grasping that concept of just like how disposable containers were, like your whole environment is disposable. And I'm like, like back in the day, we'd spend a lot of time building a system on, bare iron, and like we didn't want to break it or tear it down and rebuild it because it was so much work getting there. But to make that such a repeatable process today, and it was just something that was really, once you get that, I think you have a better experience with the DevOps process and such. So that was certainly one of the huge takeaways. Couple that with just how separate your data and your code and even the networking and volumes and storage are from your container process. That also was just like mind-boggling. So like the next part was, okay, how do I actually do development and deployment now is so different from before, and just grasping onto those new concepts certainly takes time. I think the one thing that I need to work on a lot better, and this problem is exacerbated the more automation you have, is managing your secrets. And I think that's really what led to our security incident, which I'll talk about in the talk probably this Thursday on Security Weekly. Thankfully, it was like a no big deal kind of security incident, but a security incident nonetheless, which was great. You know, no one's immune to security incidents. I kind of trace that back to in the requirement in need for automation, we neglected like certain security controls, you know, one of those being secrets and API access specifically. And so I can see others falling into that same trap. So it's very much my journey and a lessons learned, which I'm really excited to present. It actually came out better than I really had initially thought. It's hard because you have to submit these like so far in advance, right? You haven't thought through every single aspect of your talk. And now that I have, I was like, this is good. I'm in a good place.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And in fact, I think some of the lessons learned will come, as part of today's show as well for some of the topics we're going to cover. First, though, quick announcement: go to itpro.tv/securityweekly and use the code SecWeekly30 to try a free 7-day trial and receive 30% off your monthly membership for the lifetime of your active subscription. So, especially if you want to go learn some DevOps processes, I think that's a great place to go. So, actually, this week, Paul, I wanted to talk about working with developers as part of building your AppSec program. And I think that you've hit on some of the things that I wanted to talk about in today's show, which is things like giving the developers the tools to be able to move fast and break things and have that be okay, such as, the immutability of containers. And so to that end, I've had a lot of really good conversations lately. And one of the things that I brought up that I think fits pretty well to security in a DevOps world is security needs to be a little bit like the wind, in that you can't ever really see it directly, but you can see all of the impacts that it has in your organization based on the movement of the trees or the leaves in your yard. And by that I mean, so if a security can get your development team to use Docker containers, suddenly you have a much better opportunity to quickly spin up and spin down development environments. If you can get them to use things like linting or code signing or version control, then suddenly you have rapid feedback loops and the ability to quickly start injecting minor security things into their processes that they don't ever see, but they only experience in a very light way. So to get started, Paul, I actually want to dive a little bit deeper into what you were talking about just now with immutability of Docker containers. Do you want to define that for our audience and then dive into kind of the lessons learned that you've had so far with it?
Yeah, it means that the container ends up being less about the actual finished product and more about the recipe, right? Like if you think about in a food context, I've actually never made this analogy before, but I'm going to give it a go. When you create an awesome dish, right? It's not about the actual physical meal you've created and maybe goes in the refrigerator later. Like that's usually not as, sometimes it's better the second day, but it's more about how you got there, right? To preserve that process of all of your ingredients. And be able to repeat that. So basically, if you're a chef, basically throw away your meals and not care because you can repeat that process so well to create it every time that the finished product almost doesn't matter and can be replaced at any time. And I think that really kind of captures the essence of immutability. And it's such a shift from the way we've traditionally thought about systems and environments. And in fact, it was one of my drivers to implement Docker. I really wasn't even thinking DevOps. I was more thinking Python is a pain in the ass to maintain the environment, and I need a stable environment to create it. So I'm going to use a Docker container because I wanted to spend time and define my environment. And I think that really speaks to the immutability of the resulting container, that it really isn't the container. It's your source code coupled with your operating system configuration, coupled with your applications, coupled with their configurations that makes up. And then when you get a little more complicated, if your application has multiple containers, it's your Compose or Kubernetes definition that defines how to build that environment. And making sure that's right is the essence of it, so that you can throw it away and rebuild it every 10 minutes, every minute if you wanted to.
And so where I think security fits into this analogy is the fact that, in effect, if you've written down the recipe, no matter who the chef is, hopefully they can make that recipe the same way and have it come out almost as good, if not just as good, right? So in that way, I think that when working with development teams, a lot of people say, how are you going to get the developers to implement or consume security as you're introducing it into the environment? And that's hard, right? Because the developers aren't, judged on how secure their application is. They're judged on how usable the functionality is that they're delivering, and that it's drawing more customers to either stay with the product or start using the product as a result of the features you've delivered. And so in a lot of ways, what security needs to do is they need to both implement good practices or good hygiene, as we like to say, without necessarily getting in the way of the launch or the release cycle. And so I think that in a DevOps world, security has a real opportunity to put forward things like Docker containers, because now if it's all about building the recipe, well, if you can build the recipe securely, in this case, being able to get the containerization and get the different containers talking to one another inside of that network securely, and again, you now have a repeatable build process and a repeatable delivery process, it suddenly makes development's life a lot easier, because they don't have to worry about building that fragile environment and making sure that it works all over the place and doing all of these other things. They can just kind of build it once and launch it every minute if they really wanted to.
You know what the like inherent awesome thing about the whole process is that every time you build this environment in most script, and this is something like security people, I believe still play a large role in this, but every time you rebuild that environment, which could happen every minute, that you're updating to the latest operating system in all your applications. I mean, we talk about Equifax was just like the shining example of how I'm like, wow, we likely will never have a specific problem like that, because every time we do a push to QA, or every other time or whatever, there's a regular cycle where we essentially are upgrading all of our components, right? We're upgrading the application processes, whether that be your web server or your application server. We're updating all the libraries, and we're testing it on our application on those new versions as we go. And that may fail a build process, but that could be because, well, that library was updated and I need to go change a function call. Okay, I'll make that change. I'll re-push. Rather than waiting a year and going, well, I've built, thousands and thousands of lines of code that I have to go through to make that change. By the way, when you scale this out, if that library changes, now a dozen developers have to go through respectively their thousands and thousands of lines of code to get it in line with that new library. And now you're talking about 6 months to a year just for that one small change. Whereas if every time you're rebuilding the environment, you're catching these as you go, to me, that's just inherently a huge win for security right there.
Right. And so to that end, it's a situation where as a security team, it's not even necessarily that you're giving the developers security tools. You're giving them good processes, good habits, good enablers that allow them to break things and fix them quickly. And then it also, in a way, it gets them used to the fact that builds will break, right? Like on occasion, they will write bad code, build will break, and they'll have it sent back to them for a fix. So they're used to that process. And now suddenly, if you start inserting security as part of that process and it breaks builds based on bad libraries, for example, and then suddenly you're following along with things that they are already used to, and therefore it's not seen as an interruption to their day-to-day.
Right.
And so to that end, it's almost like in a modern development culture, the few things that you should do is first look for tools that will allow you to configure on behalf of your development team that build process to some degree, right? Not necessarily all of it, but at least part of it. And then the other side of it is looking at ways that you can get them used to processes that will help them be better developers, right? They'll produce more code, they'll be able to test more things, they'll be able to push to production faster, and be able to be more secure in the process, which is the huge difference with DevOps today. Is, as we talked about on a past episode, it's not DevSecOps, it's DevOps, because as a security practitioner, you're supposed to make sure that they have the right bumpers effectively in the lane so that they stay within the lines. But at the same time, they never really know that the lines are there to begin with. They just kind of follow that process because they're used to it. Yeah,
I think that was one of my big takeaways from the Phoenix Project and beyond the Phoenix Project was we've talked about the adding together development and operations and security and how we need better communication. To me, the DevOps process was really about that it's just one process and we all have input, right, but they're not separate processes. Like when we're pushing out an application, it's got the opportunity to have security testing. It has the opportunity to make sure it's reliable from an IT ops perspective. And neither one of those groups are necessarily getting in the way. They have input, but it's just all one process. And that was, I mean, if you've read the Phoenix project, right, that was like the huge win that let them operate in a more efficient manner. Was they just streamlined that. Gene Kim talks about the value stream. They've streamlined that so that you're all just working in one process. There's still development and security and IT operations to take place, but it's all part of the same process. It's not that these groups have to collaborate and link their separate processes together. To me, that was the other big takeaway.
And so one of the things that I think about, though, when it comes to DevOps versus development styles in general, right, is not everyone is in a DevOps process, and not everyone will be able to spin up a DevOps process today with a new team. Say it's a greenfield project, for example. And so the effective way to build this from a security standpoint is to start working with those tip of the spear teams to modularize what you can actually provide back to other teams in your organization. So, for example, if they're not doing version control, you introduce version control. That's easy to do, right? But now say they're working on like actual virtual machines instead of containers. Now you have to start thinking about, okay, can we streamline the process of pushing these into the virtual machines appropriately, or doing some sort of hot swapping, for example. So in a way, it's figuring out what you can make modular in terms of your delivery from a security standpoint, and then apply the different modules to the different teams that you're going to work with. Because let's face it, in the enterprise today, you could be working with hundreds of developers on hundreds, if not thousands, of different products or software development styles or what have you. And some are using the cloud and some aren't. Some are building thick clients. Some are literally just writing a WordPress like website, right? So to that end, it's a situation where you have to think about not just delivering to the tip of the spear, but the rest of the spear that follows thereafter. And you have to do that piecemeal in a lot of ways. So one of the things that I like to do in terms of working with larger organizations is doing or building a mind map. I don't know, Paul, have you ever done any mind mapping before?
Yeah, I have. Did we talk? I don't know which show I talked about this on, but there was when I was just starting out as a developer in my first job ever in security, well, in technology, really. There was like software we used to do like a mind map. And I forget what it's called to this day. And it was one of the lead developers that had showed it to me and kind of used it to map out ideas and stuff, and made parallels between like the way your brain works and the way you can map it on the software is very similar and things like that.
So for me, what I like to do in this situation is, if you are just building your application security program today in your organization, is build a mind map for those different development teams. And so there's one piece of software that I like to use on MacBook Pro. Feel free to email me if you want to know more about it. It's just hoodie@securityweekly.com. No, I don't get a kickback from this company when you ask, but there's a number of different mind map software or applications available today, whether it's Linux, Mac, Windows, or what have you. But to that end, I think that one of the first things that anyone should do is put it down and visualize it, and then share it across your organization. And it's not just who works where. It's almost a mind map of the product that they're working on, who is the owner or the like most interested party in that product, in terms of like which VP thinks of this as their pet project, for example. But also then you look at, okay, who's the technical product manager and the product manager? Because those are the people that ultimately, if you want security to be part of their sprints or their development cycle, those are the people that you need to make sure are introducing it, right? You don't need to go to every single developer on that team and convince them that security is worth doing. You just need to get the product managers to say that security is worth doing, and then allocate time accordingly as part of that sprint. So it's one of those situations where with a mind map, especially good mind map software, you can then kind of heat map it in a way, right? You can say, okay, the reds are the ones that are building the most critical applications to our business in terms of the way that we make money. Maybe they are behind on their development processes or the development life cycles that they use. And maybe they're still running a lot of their stuff on, I don't know, Windows XP, for example. It's like, okay, what are the opportunities for this team, and who do I need to now talk to to see what we can do to update their processes, to update their delivery, to update the way that they do business today. And then you can map that out across your organization. And eventually what you're going to find is there are teams that you didn't even know existed that as soon as you've got a little bit of detail on them and you've shown value from what you offer as a security team for not only offering security, but offering to help development teams get better at their craft by allowing them to deliver faster to production, allowing them to quickly iterate on features. You ultimately end up being kind of told about these teams that you can then start to sort and organize inside of the mind map.
Yeah, and it's very much a part of it. I mean, there's a huge technology piece too, but there's a huge culture and social interaction piece as well. And I think the big item that I liked from your list, Keith, was if you work with the team that will latch onto new technology and implement it, work with them first and let them spread it throughout the culture and improve it with a team that's willing to work with you, easy to work with, and doesn't have like a lot of convincing. And also the technology might fit DevOps better. You know, earlier on you mentioned that not every development project certainly is going to fit neatly and nicely into a DevOps process. Everyone's a little different, but find that team where you can make those wins and start there.
Exactly. And so working with developers, I know that as security folks, we get a bad rap most of the time when it comes to working with developers. They see us coming and they want to run. But if you can be seen as an enabler to the process, so helping them be better at their craft, but also in a way, it's kind of like a dual interest, right? They're better at their craft, but it also allows them to deliver a more secure product so that they can continue to deliver features instead of bug fixes. That makes them happier as well, right? So it's a situation where you have to identify the right parties, you have to identify the right projects in terms of where to get started, how to convince the business that what you're doing is worthwhile. And then also identifying those hot spots that you may need to address a little bit more slowly. But so it's funny, there's a Chinese proverb that I like to go back to, which is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today. So to that end, it's like, figure out the teams that, guess what? They needed this security tree 20 years ago, but they didn't get it. So figure out the seeds that you can plant with that team today so that in the future, they will be in a good spot and you can slowly help them get there. Meanwhile, you're practicing all of those things that you want to put into use with that team, with those teams that are out there at the tip of the spear, running ahead and adjusting to these DevOps processes, because you'll have a lot of lessons learned. And also you'll be able to pick up all the new technologies that are coming out today. I think we talked about a few weeks ago, Docker's all of maybe 4 years old and Kubernetes is less than 2, it feels like. So if you're working with those teams that are at the tip of the spear, it gives you all of that knowledge from a security professional standpoint of how do I secure those things in the next 10 years or 5 years or 2 years? What other teams can I have adopt this? How would they adopt it? What's going to be beneficial to them? And then figure out all of the tools, techniques, and procedures that they will need and build runbooks or playbooks to pass off to other teams and to make them more successful in the development process and more secure by default. Which is kind of a huge benefit. I don't know, Paul, if you have any last minute kind of thoughts on this topic. I did want to cover some of the learning and tools that I covered in the show notes, but any parting thoughts on this particular topic first?
Yeah, I mean, much of my presentation talks about this and I don't want to give too much away. So
Got it. Hey, are they recording at Source Boston? Do you know if it's going to be up on YouTube?
They usually do. Yeah, they usually do.
Awesome. So we'll have to put that in the show notes when it's finally out and released. In the meantime, I thought I would cover a few interesting learning and tools that I picked up this week. So there's this one tool that I picked up called Snipeit or Snipe IT, which is an open source asset management application that I thought was really interesting. They actually have a demo that's out online. Again, it's open source, so you can use it. They do obviously have the way they make money is a hosted solution if you want to use the hosted solution. But it's asset management all the way from like the physical devices that you provisioned, the cost of those devices, who they were assigned to, but also people, right? So people as assets, right? So who they are, when they were hired, what's their phone number, things like that. And I thought it was just a really cool open source technology for people to check out because, let's face it, asset management is really, really hard. And most asset management things or tools cost a lot of money. Whereas in this case, if you are able to provision it and maintain it yourself for less, and I think of this as the sweat, blood, and tears cost as opposed to the financial cost, might be worthwhile. Paul, did you get a chance to check that out at all?
I haven't, no, and I've looked into open source asset management and inventory tools, and I haven't found one that I really like enough. I think that, if you check out our interview with Leonard Rose, he on Paul Security Weekly, which was an awesome interview, by the way. Everyone should go watch that. He talks about OSSEC as being his kind of open source agent of choice, which I think is kind of interesting because I've played around with OSSEC recently a little bit, not a lot. I don't have as large of a deployment as Leonard was speaking of, but I was really impressed. So, and I don't know how much that helped. I mean, anytime you get into agent stuff, it can be hard. There's actually an open source project from, I believe it's folks at TrustedSec that make it easier to deploy OSSEC agents. So, certainly that stuff that about. The hard part about an asset management or asset inventory is constantly discovering what you don't know about and adding that into your system.
Yeah, that's the never-ending battle, as it were. Speaking of never-ending battles, by the way, there is an open source project called Astra for automated security testing for REST APIs that I thought was another cool project out on GitHub. It's got a command line interface as well as a UI that you can go ahead and basically scan your APIs for, your REST APIs for vulnerabilities. So I thought this was cool. It looks like it has a decent amount of coverage. Of course, no scanning solution is ever perfect per se, but to that end, open source is kind of quick and easy. If you're a startup and you need to first pass to test your APIs, this might be just a good thing to just throw on and see how it works.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out, cool. Keith, because I'm also looking for an open source alternative for scanning your containers. Which is kind of similar, right? Like I think there's a couple different aspects. Like you should be scanning your APIs, you should be scanning the containers themselves, and you should also have something that maybe interacts with your commits that is looking for open source software vulnerabilities, like we talked about with WhiteSource. With the container stuff, I'm looking at Claire is the open source project that does it for containers. That seems to be the one that bubbles up to the top. I'll also, I talk about the various approaches of commercial vendors as well, one of which is has a scanning component layered inside, a sponsor of this show, but also does the deeper, like monitoring your container environment for vulnerabilities.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's definitely necessary in today's world for those teams that are using Docker containers and are basically provisioning them from their base in a way that might not be secure. And so checking to make sure that the ones that you've built are still good is definitely important, because as much as things like, for example, Docker Hub or I think it's the Docker Store now scans those on your behalf before they even put them forward. The application that you've implemented in the libraries that you've pulled down after you've done like an apt-get update may not be good. And so to that end, the base container was fine up until you introduced vulnerable versions of, say Java, for example. So
yeah, or maybe you change the configuration and then there's like a SQL password sticking in there, which I've seen as well. Now, I mean, we solved that problem with Amazon RDS. Well, not really. I mean, because the password still has to be in there. We've limited it a little bit by using the serverless technology, but identifying those as they crop up. Did someone make it not just a code change, but a config change? And now all of a sudden there's some kind of security problem with my container. Can they pick up on that? And I think that's important. Also, if in my build process I'm skipping the updating, like maybe I commented that apt-get update out of my Docker file, and now I'm deploying vulnerable containers, you want something in the process that's going to tell you that happened.
Absolutely. And usually what you're going to do is you're going to set it as, warnings first, and then as it makes its way from staging to production, it becomes blocking at that point. But for sure.
It should block the build. Right? Well, I mean, that's up to you what blocks a build and what doesn't. That's obviously configurable, and that's going to depend on your maturity as well.
For sure. One other person, so this is actually a person that I wanted to highlight here. So under number 3 for learning and tools is Julia Evans. She does a lot of different kind of, whiteboards for a lot of different command line tools and different things that she is learning about, and actually puts together these nice little whiteboards. So this one specifically is on grep, which is probably one of the best, built-in tools in Linux that exists. So it goes through kind of the flags and just other interesting stuff. Julia tends to write a lot of these for many, many different commands as she is learning them. So that is, she's on Twitter at Bork, B0RK. Go check her, follow her and check out some of the stuff she's putting together, because I think that Her whiteboards are incredibly useful, and grep is one of my favorite tools, so I wanted to highlight that. Real quick, before we wrap up this segment, though, I wanted to just highlight two things. First, under number 4 for learning and tools is Honeycast. It's honeytrap.io, and it's effectively Twitch streaming for your honeypot. So you can kind of share the lessons learned of people that are going after your honeypot, and other people can kind of watch it to see what's going on for the behaviors that are taking place. I thought this was kind of cool. So I don't know, Paul, if you had a chance to check it out, but it's a kind of a way to share your honeypots with the world.
That's pretty cool. I have not seen that, no.
Yeah, that was something that just popped on my radar the other day. I thought that would be worth sharing with our listeners. Last one is, of course, our friends at Trusted Sec, specifically Dave Kennedy and the family over at DerbyCon, have a Slack channel. So they have a couple of different channels available for people, including selling and buying tickets, which I know is a hot topic given that tickets just went on sale and sold out on Saturday. But then also hiring, mentorship, charity, etc. I wanted to highlight this because I know that the community likes to generally join yet another Slack channel. Mm-hmm. And in this case, I think it's probably going to be one that's well traveled by many people that you probably know and follow on Twitter. So,
I joined today.
Yeah, I haven't joined yet, but I plan to in this case. So I have way too many Slack channels, so I got to probably drop a few of these at some point. In any case, with that, we are going to take a short break and then come back for the news.
Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unify DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW. Rapid7 powers the practice of SecOps. Using shared data, analytics, and automated workflows, SecOps unites IT, DevOps, and security teams to make security an outcome of innovation. Rapid7 combines technology, expertise, and advocacy to drive vulnerability management, application security, incident detection, and log management for more than 7,000 organizations worldwide. Power up your SecOps practice with a free trial at rapid7.com/securityweekly. Hard-coded credentials can be trouble, but not as much trouble as a vulnerable DevOps environment. If you want protection without the hassle of security slowing you down, CyberArk, the #1 provider in privileged access security, has the solution for you. With CyberArk Conjur, developers can easily secure secrets across any DevOps toolchain or platform, whether your application runs in the cloud or on premises. Eliminate the headaches of managing secrets and try Conjur open source for free with no strings attached. Visit conjur.org/ASW to get started today. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. We got some interesting stories this week. First up, a Boeing 757 was hacked remotely while it sat on the runway. This was pretty crazy to me because, it's sitting on the runway. Obviously, people are sitting in terminals and they probably have Wi-Fi access of some kind. And back in September of 2016, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security revealed it was able to successfully hack an airliner while it was on the ground in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The funniest part about this article, Paul, is they said, don't panic too much. The hack of the legacy commercial airliner was an exercise conducted by a team of security professionals. That doesn't make me feel any better, Paul. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I was wondering what the context was around this story. I mean, obviously it was a controlled test, so and they kind of made it sound like it wasn't in the in the headline, right? Like, oh my God, someone hacked an airplane. But I mean, it's a system like anything else. Of course, people are going to be able to gain unauthorized access to it. The question is how they did it. What were the details of it? What did they get access to? Define hacked here, right?
Right. And so the little articles that they gave, so this was a CyberSat summit in Tysons Corner, Virginia, that this was revealed. The details are that in this case, they kept it classified, of course, but it did involve accessing and gaining control of the plane systems through radio frequency communications. Surprise, surprise, right? So we've had a number of discussions lately, both on Paul Security Weekly as well as this show, on radio frequency hacks, whether it was the actual like door locks for, NFC, for example, or in this case, the sirens that were also hacked via the radio signals back in, I think it was Austin, Texas. So I think this is yet another situation where basically they've depended too much on radio signals or radio frequency communications to planes that in the past people didn't have the technology to actually, generate the kind of radio signals they need to generate to talk to these things. And well, now they can. So the thing that I got out of this, though, which to me I thought was, I don't know if it was crass is the right word, but at the end of the article, they stated that the cost to change one line of code on a piece of avionics equipment is $1 million, and it takes about a year to implement. So in effect, it would bankrupt a company such as like Southwest Airlines if they had to go ahead and update the code and update the systems on those planes. And in my mind, it's a situation of, yes, it is a localized attack if someone has to be in an airport to mess with the plane's avionics via radio frequency before it takes off. But even still, it's almost like, it's going to cost too much to fix it, so therefore we're not going to. Doesn't sound like the greatest excuse in this situation, which I thought was really, I don't know. Paul, do you have any thoughts to add here before we jump to a different story?
Well, yeah, I think, it's a matter of risk, and there's a big difference between, I can get on and maybe access the in-flight entertainment system and maybe plant something that tries to, Trojan or drive by everyone who accesses it versus controlling the plane's avionics equipment. Big difference there, right? And that's going to, if the bug does cause, or the, security vulnerability does cost that much to fix, you're going to balance that with the risk. Now, we don't know exactly the details of the attack, so it's tough for us to say. Let's just hope, because most of us get in airplanes more than a couple times a year, that it's nothing major, right?
Right. Well, not to mention too, right? If you can do malicious things that not only just affect the in-flight entertainment, but the actual avionics, right? And you're sitting in an airport, you could hit hundreds of planes in a single day, right? Sure. Because it's the 757 and the 737 models are pretty popular, especially by I think Delta flies those as well as Southwest and others, right? So to that end, it's like a situation of, here's hoping, but at the same time, as we've come to find it, in many cases, malicious actors get very creative with the ways that they adopt what is otherwise state agency techniques and tactics, right? So I think it's probably a matter of time before someone manages to figure out what was done here. But then again, getting your hands on or getting near a 737 or 757 to practice this sort of thing is not easy to do. So to that end, I'm just hoping that airlines will perhaps start to take this into their R&D process and deliver a secure by default before they actually, ship them to the customers that are purchasing them. So that's kind of my final thoughts there. I did want to skip ahead to the Twitter story here, which was late breaking news. I think it was Thursday of last week, where Twitter said all 336 million users should change their passwords because in this case, the company found that they were storing user passwords in plain text and an internal log as part of their system. What was most interesting about this to me is they use bcrypt, and as does GitHub, who had a similar issue earlier in the week affecting a smaller number of their customers. And that they are logging anything that could be related to credentials before it actually gets hashed. was most interesting to me in particular. But the thing that I find kind of ironic here is I think that as we get closer to GDPR being delivered here in a few weeks, we're going to see more of this story because people are going back and looking for things like,
Yeah.
log files with passwords in them. Paul, do you have anything to add?
I think it sounds to me, if I had to venture a guess, there's usually debug code involved that someone accidentally left in that is writing it to a log file before the encryption process takes place, which, the likely scenario is that nobody unauthorized had access to that log. I think Twitter is rightfully so erring on the side of caution and saying, well, if someone did get into one of our systems and did obtain a copy, everyone should change their passwords just in case. I don't think that's the case, although we'll never truly know unless someone claims to have everyone's Twitter password. I also thought it was astonishing that Twitter definitively said it was like everyone's password. Like there wasn't a subset. We talked about the RSA leak, right? It was a subset of the people, and a lot of these attacks are sometimes subsets of the. This was the every single Twitter user, which was kind of concerning. The scope of the hack, certainly, and the other bad thing about this, which is why I also believe that Twitter kind of sounded the alarm, was it was in clear text. Like it wasn't even the encrypted one where you'd have to crack them to get out. A lot of the password leaks we've seen in the past involve some level of cracking, and not that that's necessarily difficult, depending on how they encrypted it. But when you think about the volume of 300 million plus users, that's a lot of cracking. And I mean, sure, you have targeted attacks, but it wasn't even necessary. So this was bad for those reasons. I think there's probably a developer that had a heart attack or is on a downward spiral because they're the ones that left the debug code in, and I feel bad for whoever that person is.
Yeah. And honestly, though, the funniest thing about this is I get the feeling that there's probably a library in use that both Twitter and GitHub are using that caused this behavior to present itself. And so I suspect that at some point we may get a postmortem on it. I just hope that it comes sooner than later, because I guarantee you there's other companies that could probably, derive some lessons from this as well. But at the same time, I'm sure that folks like Twitter and GitHub are a little bit tight-lipped about exactly how this presented itself, maybe out of embarrassment, or maybe just simply out of trying to protect companies from, having mass panic as a result of the fact that they're also using this bad library. And there's no definitive way for you to know unless you go look at the code that you maybe implemented it badly. But that's kind of my suspicion at this point, is it's related to something in one of the libraries that they're using that caused this behavior to present itself.
I also think it's worth the headache of maintaining two-factor across your accounts.
Yes.
Which, to be quite honest, is a headache. Because sometimes you get a YubiKey, sometimes you get a text message, and sometimes you get an authenticator app. There really isn't anything that I've discovered when you're using other people's software applications that it's kind of like, oh, I have this one two-factor authentication thing. Like Facebook supports one type of YubiKey, the last I checked. Some services offer just text messages. Some let you choose between authenticator and text message. Some use the text message as a backup to your authenticator, which you might as well just dumb down to the least secure two-factor if you can't turn that off. And then if you turn that off and you're not good about keeping your phone or backing up your authenticator app settings, which admittedly I haven't really figured out, when you get a new phone, all your authenticator app stuff goes away, and then you're in a potentially a bad place.
For sure. And for me, the way that I generally deal with that, it's not the best practice, but it's a good one in my mind, is whenever you set up two-factor authentication, you have the ability to download a set of keys that you could use if you actually lost your phone or something
codes
of that nature.
Yep, I had that, thankfully.
Secure storage of that is hard, which is it's funny because what I ended up doing is I wrote a quick bash script that basically runs things through, I think it's OpenSSL. I forget the exact library that it uses, but it allows you to AES 256 encrypt anything with a password. So what I end up doing is I always download that file. I actually have it up on my GitHub. So github.com/andmyhacks/scripts has my encrypt and my decrypt shell script files. And so I literally just run it through that. I set a password to it. I put that password in my password vault. And now I've got that file stored with all of my keys securely.
Right.
And then
Outside of
generally
your,
I put that on like a...
Yeah, and outside of your password vault, right? I mean, because you could put those backup codes inside your password vault as like a note or something, but one could then
Right.
call into question like you've got your both factors of authentication essentially in your password vault. And I also know LastPass has something where they can manage those codes, which I haven't enabled because I'm paranoid, right? I don't want my factors mixing in with each other, right?
Right. And so for me, I usually put those on like an external
Mm-hmm.
hard disk as well, right? So my threat vector is literally twofold. Someone has literally stolen my external hard drive, and well, first of all, they have the password to that external drive that's already encrypted by itself. But then they must have access to my password vault as well. So I am limiting my factors of risk there pretty heavily. So that's probably the best way to deal with the situation in my mind is first, yes, set up two-factor or multi-factor authentication of any kind. The inconvenience is worth it in my mind
Mm-hmm.
when you run into these situations. When you get notified by haveibeenpwned.com, thank you, Troy Hunt,
Mm-hmm.
that you've got there was a breach and your password may have been involved in that breach, or your hashed password may have been involved in that breach. Having that second factor gives you time, right, to address that appropriately, which I think is important. Uh, Moving on from that, though, I did want to talk about how under the "if you build it, they will come" story number one, which is how somebody tried to hide a backdoor in a popular JavaScript npm package. This package was specifically the get cookies package, which is relatively new, but it was actually bundled up into other packages, such as the mail parser package, as a dependency. And so the backdoor mechanism in this case would allow for people to effectively grab browser cookies, which, by the way, most websites use those for session management. And in this case, it would allow them to input arbitrary code into a running server and execute it. So effectively, now you're running your server with the get cookies functionality to validate your sessions as the server administrator that has written this application that happens to rely on get cookies. And the backdoor now allows effectively, literally like remote code execution against your box because you're using that library. Now, I feel like we talked about exactly this problem in like episode 3 or episode 4, which was fictitious at the time of us discussing it just, a couple of months ago. And here we are in May, and it's happened. Someone's already tried to do that. Paul, any additional thoughts here? I know that NPM and just recently bought Uplift, who does the node security package. So thoughts on this, Paul?
Yeah, I think it's along those lines of that acquisition, and I'm not sure what their technology looks like. And I know they're industry buzzwords, but it's certainly a great use case for machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to review the code as automated as they can as it's committed. And maybe even take action with the artificial intelligence piece to make those happen. So people confuse the terms all the time, right? Machine learning, perhaps, to discover the patterns and identify the malicious add-ons or modules or plugins or whatever that we've discussed having this problem, and then AI that would go in and take action, based on the machine learning would be, I think, a great usage of that technology. That's of course a very, very high level of how it works or could work, for example. But I think this is a great use case for that.
Absolutely. And I think that Apple and Google try to do this in some ways with
Mm-hmm.
their respective, mobile stores. And so, yeah, this is yet another situation where the ubiquity of Node Package Manager across a number of different environments and frameworks and libraries is it's pretty much the core of everything that you do when you're developing a modern web application.
Yeah,
And
and
so
I
in
mean,
this
Apple
case,
and Google have the talent too, and Amazon.
yeah,
Because don't forget, they all have their AI things that I won't say the names because it's going to trigger everyone's their device, right? But all of the verbal Siri and Amazon Echo and the Google stuff, right? All have their artificial intelligence. So they've got like the corner on the market of the technical people who can implement this. I would see those larger companies, and Apple has certainly proven this with their iOS market, right? Being able to implement this type of technology. But the most talented people in the world, from what folks that have done the research have told me, like they pretty much work for those three companies, and they have that expertise. It'll be interesting to see if there are newer players that can bring to market this type of technology, specifically in this case, to protect malicious software from entering an ecosystem.
For sure, and especially an ecosystem that's becoming more and more important to modern web development. I mean, we covered in a previous show that 50% of the vulnerabilities in the CVE database that were reported and disclosed last year, again, that's not all of the vulnerabilities that were reported, but necessarily the ones that were reported, disclosed, and had a CVE number associated, were web vulnerabilities. And here we are talking about a package that's used in a web server that ultimately allows for remote code execution. The thing that I found interesting about this,
I think 80% of those are WordPress plugins too.
Probably, I would not be surprised.
Pretty high percentage.
That was the case.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about this is, in this case, it was MailParser, which was a deprecated package that had the get cookies package as kind of a dependency. And even though MailParser was deprecated, it still had over 66,000 weekly downloads. I'm blaming Stack Overflow here. I'm willing to bet that there's probably some serious articles about doing parsing or mail parsing in this case with webmail of some kind, I'm sure is what the applications are related to, that says to use MailParser, even though it's a deprecated package. So to that end, it's like, okay, here's the situation that we were most afraid of, is people are using the knowledge that exists, which, by the way, is still dated and the knowledge base itself hasn't been deprecated, just the package that they talk about.
And it begs the question, Keith, in a development process, how do you discover and identify packages that your application is relying on that don't necessarily have a vulnerability, right? And the package isn't broken because I'm still able to pull it down, but how do you identify those as deprecated and make a note to the developer to say, it might not be critical, like right now, it's not on fire, but by the way, this package has been deprecated and you might want to go out and find something else because there's no more updates coming to this particular package. That's something that I had not considered in our discussions on this show.
As a developer, admittedly, you generally just ignore the warnings that you're getting when you pull it down and you just keep going.
And now that I think about it, in our own internal application, I have seen that error. And I have largely ignored it because I'm like, oh, that's not a priority right now. But now in the context of our conversation about this vulnerability, I think it's something that we have to pay attention to. In that sense, in Python, it tells you when you start up your application that there are deprecated packages. So that's something you could certainly monitor and parse the logs in, with something like Jenkins or whatever. Something in your process could identify that and tell you. And you would probably still just ignore it.
Most of the time you ignore it because you want it to work. And it's the fragile infrastructure problem, right? If you have not got the Docker containers loading this appropriately, where you can go and break this and see if you can actually get it to work appropriately and, kind of bang around on it. You're not going to fix it ultimately as a developer, which is the most unfortunate thing here. But back in August of last year, NPM actually did remove 38 JavaScript packages that were seen as malicious. And apparently similar things happened with the Python package index, where they found in this case, let's see, does it say? It doesn't say in this case, but they did find a number of vulnerabilities in a similar scenario where you had dependencies that were deprecated that had malicious code in them. So if you see those warnings, do not ignore them. Actually try to go take a deeper look, because as much as it might be working today, first, as a security team or as a developer, build resilient development processes and then go fix everything as much as possible. I know we have a few minutes left here. I also wanted to cover a couple of things. First, there was under story number 2 for the If You Build It section that you can finally encrypt Slack messages. So I know that we talked, I think, on a previous show about how Slack allows any admin to read any message that you've sent in private DMs or otherwise on Slack. It is a specific setting that managers of a Slack channel can leverage. But in this case, a tool has been released, and it's called a Schlack. I think it's supposed to be like sh and Slack all at once. But in this case, it allows you to encrypt your messages so that way if you have a private message with someone else, it can't be read. It's by Minded Security. It's available as a browser extension or a patch for the Slack application. So just to kind of mention that, you use Slack internally. I know that we sometimes chat about or chat on Slack during the show, Paul. Any additional thoughts here?
Well, if you like Slack, I put a Slack channel inside your Slack channel, Keith.
Oh, there it is. There it is. What was that? It's not LL Cool J. Was it LL Cool J?
It was Exhibit. Yes.
Sorry.
Exhibit.
Sorry. I know. MTV show of old. The interesting thing that I thought about this was it's using Crypto.js, which is a JavaScript library that is not, from what they say here, it's not great. It relies on pre-shared keys. But in my mind, it's better than nothing. So definitely check that out. That's story number 2 under the "If you build it, they will come"
Oh,
section.
so it sounds like it's kind of like OTR was for
Yeah,
like Pigeon and stuff like that, and it was over various protocols, instant messaging protocols, that if you generated a key, you could do a key handshake with someone else who had generated a key,
yep.
exchange public keys, right, and then have your messages encrypted to and from each other.
I think in this case, it's exactly a pre-shared key, but don't share it inside of Slack because that defeats the whole purpose. Because someone could go read that pre-shared key, and therefore they're not listening to your conversations, right? Like, in effect, you need to under a different encrypted channel, share the pre-shared key that you're going to use for your Slack discussions, so that way they can be encrypted now as well. So. We got to get Jeff Mann on to talk about this because that man knows crypto better than anyone
It's
alive,
true.
as far as I'm concerned. Well, maybe not anyone alive, but most people I know personally. And so I'd love to get him to come on and talk about crypto. Moving ahead, because I did want to cover a couple of things. So under food for thought, there was a picture that I linked to that Chris Eng shared, which is from, I believe it was the most recent Amazon internal summit that they have, or internal conference that they have, which is called the Evolving Developer Mindset. I'll read it for the audience because I think it's important. And this is by Werner Vogels, the Amazon CTO, from last year's AWS reInvent. Werner says, security is everyone's job now, not just the security teams. With continuous integration and continuous deployment, all developers have to be security engineers. We move too fast for there to be time for reviews by the security team beforehand. That needs automation, and it needs to be integrated into your process. Each and every piece should get security integrated into it before and after being deployed. Amen. Any additional things to add here, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I somewhat disagree. I think that security's role is not just to identify vulnerabilities or identify, process improvements. I think a lot of it is being able to like qualify risk, right? And
Yeah.
and describe risk and paint a picture and help do the threat modeling and just take into consideration all of the security controls and all of the security risks and help developers with that. I mean, it's one thing to tell developers, well, you always have to be running the latest version. Like, we all know that's not going to happen. You have to put it in context. So
right.
I do see a security role living for the foreseeable future, if not to like rubber meets the road security, but helping with that process and bringing the knowledge of and experience of security, because developers still need to be focused on developing code. And sure, they're going to play a larger role, I think, in the execution, but there's still that architecture phase that needs to happen. And I think security is going to play a role in that process. In fact, I'll talk about it in my talk on Wednesday. When you're putting together your architecture for whatever software, like let's say you're using Docker in a DevOps environment, when you put together your architecture, security has to be there to help with, that traditional security knowledge we have certainly applies to a microservices environment, let's say, because there are concepts, and I have it in air quotes, like networking, right? And
right.
Data storage and configuration, and that stuff is there. It's just different today, but there's still a security architecture that has to be taken into consideration. And I don't think we should put it on developers to understand every different threat model there is out there and build the whole thing on their own. I think we have to help with that process. I think we should help with that process. And it's not because developers can't do it. It's that everyone has their different focus, right? We can't expect every developer to be a security expert. We need them to execute our security architecture, right? And they're going to take a larger role, I think, than more traditionally.
And I think that what will ultimately happen is security professionals, especially ones that work with software development teams in general, will almost become embedded in the software team, right? Like they will be a person on that team that is identifying technologies that can allow them to deliver their product securely without having to think too much about it, which is ultimately, I think, where I see security professionals, especially application security professionals, moving toward. Now, there will always be those organizations that are, 10, 20, 50 years behind on the way that they do security or the way that they do development. But more and more, I think what will ultimately happen is those security professionals will need to understand how development actually works, and then also be able to identify technologies that can help the development team be better at their job without having to think about being secure in the process. They just will be. So two last things I wanted to cover is first, it's a couple of weeks old now, but Haroon Meer and the folks at Thinkst, so they make Canary.tools, which is like you can put a honeypot on files and things. They also make, of course, network-based canaries. They had a nice review of hosting their booth at RSA this year. And I thought, what a cool idea to take the process of going to RSA and treating it like a feedback loop, just like you would when you're doing development, right? You do A/B testing, you try to push it to production, and you do build testing. And so they actually took the whole concept of going out to RSA for just under 50K and did like an entire write-up and a reflection on it. Some of the things, of course, that they learned is talking about, price gouging by RSA for booth size, how vendors can be a little bit intense. And then also for them, it was actually a lot of value in their demo specifically. But I'll let folks read the article. That's story number 2 under the food for thought section. I'm a big fan of Haroon and the team over there at Thinkst, so I definitely recommend checking it out, especially if you work for a company that's thinking about having a booth at RSA. I think it's a very even-keeled review of, cost to value analysis for them and for, I'm sure, other companies will find value there as well.
I think it was an interesting piece of the puzzle, and I think that attending an event and having a presence there is just, it's one part of your go-to-market plan. And I thought I thought their analysis of the actual RSA conference itself was good, and I appreciate them sharing that information. I think that's a good piece of knowledge to have. However, I didn't think the article kind of spoke to how that fits into your overall nurturing campaign.
Right.
And, these are conversations we have on Business Security Weekly, certainly not necessarily for here, but it didn't speak to the full picture. I also think that if you can make sales right at RSA, that's great. Also consider, could you have made those somewhere else, or how that fits in your overall plan to nurture people and have it be part of your program. In that sense, maybe the investment was worthwhile, maybe it wasn't. It depends on how you look at it, right? And I think that you can make more of your return on investment by having an encompassing marketing plan that taking what Haroon and team have put together and taking that into consideration as to what it costs and what the value is and incorporating that into a larger plan. I just, I thought that was something that was, not necessarily missing, but it was a piece of the puzzle.
Sure. This was we get the microservices architecture view of this. We got to see just this containers view of the overall picture. And you're right. There's a bigger picture here to be orchestrated by marketing teams and product development teams and of course sales teams, right? Yep. So I liked it from the perspective of it was a ground truth review of their experience in the booth, but it is a microcosm, for lack of a better term. You're right, Paul. It's not an overall picture of everything that they're going to do this year, but it's if you are going to do RSA and only going to do RSA, these are the things to take away from it. So I thought that was good. The last thing I did want to cover here, of course, there is our favorite commit strip under number 5 for food for thought. That's reading an article on your phone for 2018. But the last thing I did want to talk about was VS Code extensions for happier JavaScript coding. Myself, I'm a huge fan of VS Code, and so it does have a few must-haves in there. That's ESLint, GitLens, to-do highlight, and import cost. Of those, the one that I'm going to highlight here is the import cost plugin, which quite literally will tell you in almost like a commented fashion next to every import you do in your code, how large of an import it is that you are now inferring, whether that's 64 kilobytes or 5 kilobytes, which, as I'm sure you've probably seen, Paul, development today seems to just be using as much possible space on your system as it can consume. And so in this case, I thought that was kind of cool. Any additional thoughts for that particular one? I know that you must be doing at least a decent number of imports on your post-production works tool.
Sure. Yeah. And, I think it speaks to containers in one of your goals. And it's not something that's easy when you take an existing application, certainly, and start to put that in a container environment. To get your containers as small as possible is really hard, but it's really important, right? Like it helps with the entire flow of your DevOps process to have those containers be as small as possible, and looking at your imports is certainly part of that. So I like this tool that it can help me make sure that my containers are as small as possible, because that can, in large environments, that can have some pretty big impacts as to how much you spend in compute power cost, like the whole development workflow, making that software development process as fast as possible. really comes down to speed. I think it's one of the huge advantages between containers and virtualization is it gives you that ability to really trim down your containers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And especially like if you're doing that today with a JavaScript application, I know that, importing things from Node can be immense. And so if you're going to import just the piece that you need rather than the whole 9 yards, it's going to make your life a whole lot better. The last couple of nice to haves that they include for extensions is Prettier, which is a code formatter, Open in Browser, which I use personally, VS Code styled components, and bookmarks, which I thought was kind of an interesting concept. I went and grabbed it as soon as I saw it. Which is basically bookmarking parts of your code if it isn't necessarily readable or you don't know exactly where a function is going to live because you have kind of disparate or dispersed code that you've written for different functions or different packages inside of your application. I thought bookmarks was pretty cool because now you can kind of quickly jump between things inside of your application. Because Paul, as you and I both know, documentation is a pipe dream sometimes.
Yeah, certainly.
Cool. Well, with that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git commit and stay classy.